What if the greatest threat to the American economy isn't a foreign competitor, a market crash, or a global crisis, but a quiet decision made behind closed doors? What if the real danger isn't tariffs themselves, but who gets spared from them and who doesn't? Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on a moment that forces a hard question. When government starts choosing winners and losers, does America stop being America? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't about politics. It's about power, fairness, and the future of the system we all depend on. Fairness is not an abstract concept in economic policy. It is the spine that holds a free market system upright. When a government steps into the marketplace, its responsibility is not to decide which companies deserve protection and which ones should struggle, but to create a level field where competition determines outcomes. The moment policy starts favoring one company over another, the rules of the game quietly change. Markets stop rewarding efficiency, innovation, and disciple, and instead begin rewarding access, influence, and proximity to power. That shift may seem subtle at first, but its consequences are profound and long-lasting. A tariff applied unevenly is not just a trade tool, it is a statement. It tells entrepreneurs that success may depend less on building better products and more on building better connections. It tells workers that their livelihoods, be impacted not by global competition alone, but by political discretion. And it tells investors that predictability, the lifeblood of capital formation, is negotiable. A system like that does not strengthen an economy, it slowly corrodes it from within. The strength of American capitalism has always rested on a simple promise: equal rules applied equally. That promise gave rise to industries, lifted millions into the middle class, and attracted capital from every corner of the world. When exceptions become the norm, that promise weakens. Selective tariff relief creates artificial winners, but it also creates a long list of quiet losers. Smaller businesses that lack lobbying power, consumers who face higher prices, and workers whose companies are forced to compete at a disadvantage. There is also a moral dimension that cannot be ignored. Policies that pick winners and losers undermine public trust. People begin to believe the system is rigged, that effort and merit matter less than favoritism. Once that belief takes hold, confidence erodes, not just in markets, but in institutions themselves. And when trust disappears, growth slows, innovation stalls, and social cohesion frays. Supporters of selective exemptions often argue they are pragmatic or strategic. But pragmatism without principles is just opportunism. A strong economy does not require constant intervention. It requires consistency. Businesses can adapt to high tariffs or low tariffs, but they cannot plan around uncertainty and selective enforcement. Stability, transparency, and fairness are far more powerful than short-term political wins. If the goal is to strengthen the nation, then policy must reflect the values that built it. Equal treatment under the law is not a slogan, it is an operating system. Abandoning it in favor of selective advantage sends a dangerous message that America's economic future can be negotiated behind closed doors. That is not competitiveness, that is not leadership. And it is certainly not the kind of system that sustains prosperity over generations. A truly strong economy does not protect a few at the expense of many. It challenges everyone under the same rules and allows the best ideas, the hardest work, and the smartest execution to rise. Anything less may look powerful in the short term, but in the long run, it weakens the very foundation it claims to defend. When economic policy begins to reward access instead of achievement, the system quietly drifts away from capitalism and towards something far less productive. A market economy thrives when outcomes are determined by competition, discipline, and innovation. It falters when success is shaped by who can get a meeting, who can make a call, or who can secure an exemption. That is the moment when, capitalism stops being dynamic and starts becoming distorted. Selective tariff treatment is a textbook example of how cronyism takes root. On paper, tariffs are justified as tools to protect domestic industries or address unfair trade practices. But when exemptions are carved out for certain companies while others are left exposed, the policy ceases to be strategic and becomes discretionary. Discretion is dangerous because it introduces subjectivity where rules should be clear and consistent. Markets do not fear tough rules, they fear uneven ones. Crony capitalism does not announce itself loudly. It grows quietly, normalized through exceptions, special cases, and temporary relief. Over time, companies learn that the smartest investment may not be in research, workers, or technology, but in influence. Resources are diverted away from productivity and toward lobbying. That is not wealth creation. It is rent-seeking. And rent-seeking adds no value to society. It merely redistributes advantages toward those already closest to power. The long-term cost of this behavior is immense. Smaller firms, startups, and innovators rarely have the scale or connections to compete for favor. The treatment, they end up paying higher costs, losing market share, or never entering the market at all. This quietly strangles competition. Fewer competitors mean less innovation, higher prices, and lower quality for consumers. The economy may look stable on the surface, but underneath, its creative energy is being drained. There is also a corrosive effect on leadership culture. When corporate success becomes linked to political favor, executives are incentivized to align themselves with shifting political winds rather than long-term strategy. Decision-making becomes short-sighted. Capital allocation becomes defensive. Instead of asking, how do we build something better? Companies begin asking, how do we avoid being disadvantaged? That is not how strong enterprises are built. Perhaps most damaging of all is the signal this sends to the public. People intuitively understand fairness. When they see certain companies protected while others struggle under the same economic conditions, confidence in the system erodes. The perception that the game is rigged is just as harmful as reality. Once that belief takes hold, trust in markets, institutions, and leadership weakens and rebuke. Building trust is far harder than preserving it. A healthy economy does not require favoritism to succeed. It requires rules that are clear, predictable, and applied without exception. When government resists the temptation to intervene selectively, it preserves the integrity of the market. When it does not, it invites inefficiency, stagnation, and resentment. True economic strength is not measured by how well a few connected companies perform under protection. It is measured by how many businesses can compete, grow, and succeed under the same rules. Cronyism may offer short-term comfort to some, but in the long run, it undermines the very system that made opportunity possible in the first place. Tariffs are often discussed in abstract terms: percentages, trade balances, geopolitical leverage, but their real impact is far more personal. At their core, tariffs function like a tax, and like most poorly designed taxes, they do not fall evenly. They show up quietly in higher prices at the grocery store, increased costs for household goods, more expensive cars, appliances, and construction materials. And when those costs rise, they do not land on balance sheets alone. They land on kitchen tables. When tariffs are applied broadly, at least the burden is shared transparently. But when some companies are granted relief while others are not, the outcome becomes deeply unequal. Favored firms can shield themselves from higher costs, protect margins, and maintain pricing power. Unfavored firms cannot. They pass costs down the chain to workers through slower wage growth, to consumers through higher prices, or to both. The result is a system where everyday Americans pay more, while a select few are insulated. This matters because middle and lower income households do not have the flexibility to absorb price shocks. Wealthier households can adjust. They have savings, optional spending, and investment income that cushions the blow. For families living paycheck to paycheck, even small increases in prices compound quickly. A few extra dollars per week on groceries, fuel, or utilities may not make headlines, but over time it reshapes financial security, opportunity, and dignity. Selective tariff policies deepen this imbalance. They effectively transfer economic pain away from well-connected corporations and onto households that have no seat at the table. That is not a market outcome, it is a policy choice. And when policy choices consistently place greater strain on those least able to bear it, the social contract weakens. People stop believing the system works for them because in very real, measurable ways, it doesn't. There is also a second-order effect that is often overlooked. When companies face higher input costs without relief, they cut back where they hiring slows, investments delayed, benefits are trimmed. Over time, this suppresses wage growth, particularly for hourly workers and lower skilled labor. So the same policy that raises prices also restrains income. That double pressure is not theoretical. It is felt in communities across the country. Supporters of selective exemptions may argue that protecting certain companies protects but protection that is uneven simply shifts risk. It does not eliminate it. Jobs tied to politically favored firms may be shielded, but others become more vulnerable. A healthy economy does not safeguard employment by privilege. It sustains employment by growth, competition, and rising productivity. If the goal is to strengthen the middle class, policy must be honest about who pays. A system that quietly taxes consumers while sparing the powerful is not pro-worker, pro-family, or pro-growth. It is regressive by design, even if unintended. Economic leadership requires confronting that reality, not obscuring it behind rhetoric. A strong nation does not build prosperity by concentrating protection at the top and distributing costs at the bottom. It builds prosperity by creating conditio. Where prices are fair, wages can rise, and opportunity is broad. When policy forgets that, it may claim to defend the economy, but it does so by asking the very people who can least afford it to carry the heaviest load. A nation's economic strength is not measured only by GDP figures or stock market highs. It is measured by the credibility of its principles. For decades, the defining advantage of the American system has been trust. Trust that contracts are enforced, rules are transparent, and opportunity is not reserved for a select few. That trust did not appear overnight. It was earned through consistency, restraint, and a commitment to fairness that allowed businesses and investors to plan for the long term with confidence. When policy begins to appear selective, that confidence weakens. Markets can tolerate tough decisions, but they cannot function efficiently when rules feel arbitrary. If companies believe that outcomes depend on political discretion rather than economic merit, capital becomes cautious, investment slows, risk premiums rise, and innovation takes a backseat to preservation. The damage is rarely immediate, but it is cumulative, and by the time it becomes visible, it is far harder to reverse. Global investors pay close attention to these signals. Capital is mobile, and it seeks environments where the rules are predictable and evenly applied. When favoritism enters the equation, uncertainty follows. The question shifts from, is this a good investment, to will the rules change? That single doubt is enough to redirect capital elsewhere. Over time, this weakens not just markets, but the country's standing as a reliable destination for long-term investment. There is also a reputational cost that extends beyond economics. Leadership on the global stage is built on credibility. When a nation advocates free markets and fair competition abroad, but practices selective advantage, at home, its message loses force. Allies question consistency. Competitors exploit contradictions. Influence erodes, not because of what is said, but because of what is done. Credibility, once diminished, is not easily restored. Domestically uneven policy feeds polarization. Businesses and communities begin to view success as politically mediated rather than earned. That perception fuels resentment, and division, undermining social cohesion. People lose faith not only in markets, but in institutions meant to serve the public interest. An economy can survive cycles, shocks, and even crises, but it struggles to thrive without shared belief in fairness. Strong leadership requires resisting the temptation to manage outcomes. The role of policy is not to engineer success for specific players, but to establish a framework where success can emerge organically. History shows that the most resilient economies are those that allow competition to function freely, even when the results are uncomfortable in the short term. Intervening selectively may feel decisive, but it often sacrifices long-term stability for short-term control. Consistency is not weakness, it is discipline. Applying AME rules to everyone sends a powerful signal that the system can be trusted. It reassures workers that effort matters, entrepreneurs that innovation is rewarded, and investors that the ground beneath them is solid. That assurance is a competitive advantage no tariff or exemption can replicate. A nation that values its future must protect its credibility as fiercely as its industries. Once trust in fairness is lost, growth becomes harder, leadership becomes contested, and opportunity narrows. Economic strength is not sustained by favoritism. It is sustained by principles applied without exception, even when doing so requires restraint. Policy choices reveal priorities, and over time, shape the trajectory of a nation. Short-term decisions may deliver immediate political or economic relief, but it is the long-term consequences that ultimately define success or failure. When economic policy becomes inconsistent or selectively applied, it plants seeds of instability that may not surface right away, but grow steadily beneath the surface. By the time their impact is fully visible, cost of correction is far higher than the cost of restraint would have been. An economy thrives on clarity. Businesses make investments years in advance. They build factories, train workers, and allocate capital based on assumptions about future conditions. When rules change unpredictably, or worse, when they change for some but not for others, planning becomes guesswork. Capital hesitates. Innovation slows. Risk-taking declines. Over time, the economy becomes less dynamic, not because opportunity disappeared, but because confidence did. Selective policy also distorts behavior. Instead of competing to build better products or more efficient operations, companies adapt by managing exposure. They diversify politically instead of strategically. This is an invisible tax on productivity. Time, talent, and capital are diverted away from innovation and toward protection. The economy does not collapse under this weight, but it underperforms, and chronic underperformance is far more damaging than a temporary downturn. There's also a generational cost that rarely enters the debate. Young entrepreneurs and future leaders absorb signals from the system around them. When they see succeed, linked to favoritism rather than merit, ambition shifts. The incentive to take risks, challenge incumbents, and build something new weakens. Over time, the pipeline of innovation narrows. The nation may still appear strong, but its future capacity for growth quietly erodes. On the global stage, inconsistency invites retaliation. Trade partners respond not just to tariffs themselves, but to how they are applied. Selective enforcement creates friction, encourages countermeasures, and complicates negotiations. What begins as a domestic exception can escalate into broader trade instability. The costs of these conflicts rarely stay confined to boardrooms. They spill into supply chains, employment, and consumer prices. Leaders. HIP requires thinking beyond the next cycle. The most successful economic systems are those that resist the urge to micromanage outcomes and instead focus on building durable frameworks. Predictability, fairness, and equal application of rules may not generate headlines, but they generate resilience. They allow economies to absorb shocks, adapt to change, and remain competitive over decades. Strength is often mistaken for control. In reality, strength is the confidence to let markets function within clear, consistent boundaries. When policy respects that balance, it creates an environment where growth is organic and sustainable. When it does not, it trades long-term vitality for short-term optics. A nation's future is shaped not by how aggressively it intervenes, but by how wisely it governs. Fairness applied consistently is not a constraint on power, it is a multiplier of trust. And trust, once established, becomes the most valuable economic asset a country can possess. One that no selective policy can replace, and no short-term gain can justify putting at risk. So here's the real question. And we're left with not who benefits today, not who gets an exception tomorrow, but what kind of system are we willing to accept going forward? A nation built on fair competition cannot survive on selective advantage, because once the rules bend for a few, they eventually break for everyone. The future of this economy will not be decided by slogans or favoritism, but by whether fairness still matters when it's inconvenient. And that decision, make no mistake, will define the next chapter of America's story.